Now a couple words about Bill McKibben, who truly needs no introduction for this audience. He already met several good friends here. And it's an overused term, but I'm going to use it because I think it fits. He really is pretty much a rock star in the environmental movement. And as a man of letters, he is a best-selling author and writer of major significance. He last visited the Writers Institute in 1992. We've been wanting to bring him back ever since. As you can imagine, though, he's in high demand, and we're very grateful that Bill made room in his very busy schedule. So get this, he raced 4 hours over here from a symposium on fighting poverty and living sustainably held earlier today at Villanova University. How's that for dedication? For more than 3 decades, he has deftly juggled his dual callings as author and activist. Ever since he burst on the scene with the 1989 publication of The End of Nature, his groundbreaking book on global warming, long before the term climate change was in wide circulation. That's when I first met Bill McKibben. I'll tell a little story. He'd been writing talk of the town pieces for the New Yorker. He was a first-time author pitching a new book. I was a feature writer for the Albany Times-Union. And to be honest, Bill, nobody else was jumping and stepping up to do that interview. So you came into the newsroom, and we had a great interview. And I started reading this book, and it was amazing. It stopped me in my tracks. It was basically sending out an impassioned SOS about a looming environmental crisis. It was a dire warning that the impact of humans and carbon emissions had so altered the Earth's atmosphere with greenhouse gases, acid rain, depletion of the ozone layer, that all nature's species were endangered. It was an impassioned plea to change our ways and also a handbook for survival. He has extensive scientific data and compelling prose, and he was sounding this alarm on what everyone now calls an existential crisis. Bill McKibben was coming to the Times-Union that day in 1989 with a Stop the Presses story. The Boston Globe called it, quote, a righteous Jeremiad. And here I was, a lowly feature writer, by default, interviewing this man who had come to be seen as a prophet in his own land, and a world-renowned environmental scholar and passionate activist. Since The End of Nature came screaming out of the gate, serialized in the New Yorker, published in more than 24 languages, considered a classic alongside Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, Bill has not slowed down. He's published 24 more books and collections as author or editor. He continues his journalistic practices and contributes a steady stream of essays, articles, and op-ed pieces for a wide variety of publications. We were talking earlier this evening, he did all today, sent a piece to Substack, Mother Jones, and New Yorker. Now that's a working journalist. So he divides his time between the Adirondacks and Vermont, 2 of the most beautiful places on earth. He teaches at Middlebury College. His wife is the author Sue Halpern, and they have 1 child, a statistic he argued for in his 1998 book, Maybe One, A Case for Smaller Families. And then as an activist, he helped found Step It Up in 2007, led a 5-day walk across Vermont, demanded that Congress take action on global warming. That effort started gaining more traction, and then he went to the next level in 2009 with a new campaign in global grassroots climate organization 350.org, so named because scientists determined that anything above 300 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was extremely dangerous. In 2009, that year, the level was already 385 parts per million. And last I could find, it had crested 421 parts per million in 2022. And on its website, 350.org's mission reads, quote, we're an international movement of ordinary people working to end the age of fossil fuels and build a world of community-led renewable energy for all. And most recently, he founded Third Act. They like to call themselves the Rocking Chair Rebellion. It's got over 50,000 members and is putting pressure and holding demonstrations, making big banks divest from fossil fuel companies instead of funding the climate crisis. Which brings us to the focus of our conversation tonight, Bill's most recent book, just out last week in paperback, The Flag, the Cross, and the Station Wagon. A graying American looks back at his suburban boyhood and wonders what the hell happened. He's an ordinary person doing extraordinary things. Please give a warm UAlbany welcome for Bill McKibben. All right, Bill. We're so glad you made the trip from Villanova. Thanks for coming back to UAlbany. We got to start with the title, though, because we had a little fun on Twitter. So my colleague Mike Huber, who does all of our marketing and promotions, wanted to take out a little kind of boost ad in Facebook. And it immediately got flagged, and you were shut down and censored because their algorithms said hell is not advisable. And you said, I can read what you wrote. It was brilliant. You wrote, "This actually is the funniest thing I've ever seen. I'm a Methodist Sunday school teacher, and even I don't think, what the hell is strong language? I guess the internet is a pretty cleaned up place these days." So we can start there. I know we got a lot to cover tonight. We're going to have time for audience questions. We are going to get you on the road to Vermont before the clock strikes midnight. But what's going on with Facebook? I guess they've solved all the world's problems.
Yes, I guess it's you know, it astounded me because I never even swear on Twitter or anything. You know, I'm like the best citizen of the. But there you are. What you know. The funny thing is that subtitle has been was really the best, in some ways, the best part of the book, because so many people have said to me, yeah, that's kind of how I feel too. This was not the way that I expected things were going to turn out when I was a certain age. And we'll talk about third act, but I think that's a lot of the impetus behind it, you know? It's not that we didn't have illusions about, you know, we lived through Watergate, you know, and so we understood that our systems could be corrupt, but we did not, at least I did not expect that we would reach the point where thousands of people would invade the nation's capital, killing police officers in order to stop the counting of votes. We knew that there could be air pollution and water pollution, which is why, you know, we marched on the first Earth Day to get the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. I did not suspect that we were going to figure out a way to melt the poles, you know, in my lifetime. So that sense of things have gone seriously awry and we better figure out how to get them back on track before we go is a big part of my work now.
I see a lot of gray in the audience and here too, so I think that title resonates with a lot of us too. But it's such a personal book. It's really a sort of memoir. And I see your career as holding the mirror up to corporate greed, government malfeasance, apathetic, malevolent actors of all stripes, while telling inconvenient truths about climate change and other issues. But here, you hold that mirror up to yourself. It's very honest, critical, at times damning of what you believed and how you have changed your view about how you grew up, including white privilege, white supremacy. So let's talk, was it harder writing this personal compared to other more researched, scientific, data-driven books?
In certain ways, but in certain ways it came quite easily. It's as close to a memoir as I will ever write, but it's not really that much of a memoir. And it's really only about 10 years in my life, the time from when I was 10 to when I was 20. Because, and the reason I decided to do it was because in so many ways it was such a typical childhood, almost too typical for, you know, to be believed. I mean, we lived halfway down a street called Middle Street. in our suburban town. And this suburban town was Lexington, Massachusetts, which was as all-American in certain ways as it was possible to get. And, you know, my Boy Scout troop raised the flag over the Battle Green on the morning we celebrated the bicentennial in 1976, you know. So it was a rich vein to get to mine. The American suburban moment, that moment from sometime in, you know, after the Second World War up through sometime in the mid-1970s, when almost all the growth in America was coming. And when we built this thing, essentially this new landform, the suburb, was incredibly interesting. It let me, in this case, write a lot about race and economic inequality, and also a lot about the carbon debt that we owe, since that American suburbanization was the single biggest puff of CO2 we've ever put in the atmosphere. The industrialization of China second, but a fairly distant second to that huge amount of carbon. So it was a good case study in its averageness, but there were also, partly because of Lexington's history, really interesting things going on. You want to tell a story?
Yeah, I mean, you're a tour guide. You've got your little tricorn hat. You're on the green. You're giving tours. But it's at what point, when you get educated and you read more, you realize that that was kind of a fiction that you were telling all the tour guides, right? About American exceptionalism and
yes and no. I mean, you know, I mean, one of the points of the book is, I think that progressives in America were probably wrong to surrender the flag wholly, because there's a lot in our history that's actually, I mean, I told the story of what happened on Lexington Green, and it was a powerful story, because this was the first place anybody managed to stand up to, you know, a colonial empire. And that was a remarkable thing. I mean, people were all of a sudden convicted of the idea that they didn't need a king to tell them what to do. And that was a profound turn in human history, and one that Americans should be proud of. On the other hand, it was remarkable to go back and do the research and learn all sorts of other things. I was reading, just in the sort of background of doing this, I went back and read Paul Revere's account of his ride out to Lexington. And just in passing, at one point in this thing, he's describing evading some British cavalry on Charlestown Common. And he says, and it's right below the place where Mark was hanging in chains. And then he just goes on. What's this about? I don't know. After considerable research, because there really wasn't much on it, it turns out that 20 years before the Revolution, a slave in Boston named Mark had killed his very brutal master, and he and his sister did this, and they were caught, and she was executed right away, and he was tarred and feathered and killed, and then hung in a gibbet, an iron cage, for his body to rot. And there it stayed for decades, to the point where it was just a landmark where Revere assumed everybody would know precisely who he was talking about. So that puts a different spin on this sense of the Sons of Liberty and what you're fighting. Right. And so, you know, coming to terms with our history is a difficult, interesting job that's easy to err on every side, it seems to me. And for me, it was interesting, particularly because the book begins with this description of an event on Lexington Green when I was 10.
Yeah, 1971, the John Kerry's leading this veterans against the Vietnam War, and the largest civil disobedience and the largest arrest. Your father,
that's right,
is a Boston Globe business editor, and tell that story.
So the John Kerry, lanky, charismatic young lieutenant, just returned from Vietnam, head of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. he and his crew want to bivouac on Lexington Green as a demonstration, you know. The town fathers, and indeed they were mostly fathers in those days, said, no, we'll arrest you if you do. And so hundreds of townspeople in Lexington turned out to sit down with them, and they all got arrested and taken to the DPW garage. It remains the largest civil disobedience action in Massachusetts history, and my father among them. Mild-mannered business reporter, very out of character, made a deep impression on me, convinced me of the importance of nonviolence, something that stuck with me all my life, but also, for me at 10, I thought that this was of a piece with what was happening in the, I mean, my sense of the world of America was that it was getting better through all that conflict and contention and everything else, that we were still engaged in the kind of group project that had begun in the Depression of building a better country, what LBJ called the Great Society, what Dr. King called the beloved community. You know, and this seemed a part of it. Clearly the pull of history was pushing in the right direction. If hundreds of suburbanites were willing to go to jail to protest this unjust war, you know, but when I started researching this, and I still feel that strongly, and I've spent my life now, I'm sort of overdetermined, I've spent my life getting arrested, so what can I tell you? But within a few weeks of that, something else happened in this town that was remarkably interesting in just the other way. In the 60s, Lexington was basically segregated, not by law, and not particularly even by, I think, prejudice or inclination, just by money. And so after Dr. King had visited in mid-1960s and given a speech that everybody in town came to, they formed the grandly named Suburban Responsibility Commission. And the first thing they decided was that they should figure out how to have some affordable housing in Lexington. And everybody, you know, all the grandees of the town got behind it, and the ministers and everything, and they came up with a plan for an affordable housing project with 150 units in Lexington. And Lexington town meeting, it has a representative town meeting, so 200 and some representatives from 9 precincts approved it, and it looked like it was going to happen until people petitioned to demand a referendum on this. And then, in the privacy of the voting booth, Lexingtonians voted 2-1 against it. And that was that. The end of real... So for me, what that came to symbolize was the other current in American life. Not this group project, but this privatized view of the world where, you know, property values above all. And I think that the 1970s was really a working out of which of those paths we were going to go down. And I think we made a truly fateful decision in 1980, in the most important election of my lifetime, when we decided conclusively that we were no longer interested in operating as a society. We were going to operate as individuals, and markets were going to solve our problems, and so on. I mean, it was Reagan's great pal, Maggie Thatcher, who literally said, there is no such thing as society. There are only individual men and women. And that's the world that we've in many ways spent most of my life in, and it's the world where we've stood idly by as the temperature of the planet went through the roof, and as that economic chasm between people steadily widened, and where the racial wealth gap managed to get bigger than it was in 1970.
Because you do your due diligence as a reporter. You do a lot of interviewing, you dig into records. You know, that example of keeping apartments out was really economic discrimination and racism. I looked up the statistics for Lexington in 2023. Median house is about $999,000, $1 million, 33,000 residents, 1.3% black in 2023. I mean, it's held
yes,
completely white.
So let me tell two stories, two things to kind of update. The first is, we should not be surprised at the lack of, the fact that the racial wealth gap has not narrowed, because an extraordinary percentage of our wealth over the last few decades has been basically the result of housing appreciation. So my parents bought their house in Lexington in 1970 for 30 grand, which today about $200,000 in today's money. When the last sold a year ago, this same house, exact same house sold for $1 million. So that $800,000 was just if you happened to be in the escalator at the beginning of that, you got to ride it all the way up, and that was that. And that's who was on the escalator at the beginning, people who had the $30,000, you know. Having spent $1 million on it, the last buyers then immediately tore it down and put up a house that looks like a cross between a junior high school and a medium security prison, you know. However, I have a piece of good news to add to this. And the piece will be out in the New Yorker in the next couple of days. But last Tuesday night, Lexington town meeting, 52 years later, voted to rezone a large portion of the town to allow multifamily housing for the first time. So it doesn't erase the debt that happened but it is a sign that there are forces at work right now. Who knows how it'll come out, but I do find it, though I have many tussles with him, I do find it moving to watch Joe Biden at work, because I think what we're seeing is not an attempt to return to the Clinton presidency or the Obama presidency, but an attempt to recreate in some ways the best parts of the LBJ presidency, to spend lots of money using federal power to actually try and solve problems around climate, around housing, around some other things. So the story's not written yet, you know. We're seeing how these things come out, but the damage done in the intervening 50 years is massive and perhaps fatal. So, you know, that's the kicker to the story.
I mean, the baby boomers come in for a lot of blame, and you sort of track them as across the station wagon, and you know, both religion and economics, and sort of using far more than their share of resources as a generation. But this 350.org and other movements you've been involved with, they're really young people. Yep. So how does a boomer like you lead young people, and they don't just say, "Okay, boomer," every time you come up with an idea? And how do they follow you?
You know, here's the, and this is a good conversation, because I sense just from looking around that I may have 4 or 5 generational, you know, cohorts in this audience. Yeah, I've done most of my organizing's been always with young people, because that's who's been doing it. I started 350.org with 7 college students, and then, you know, one of the big campaigns we got going was this fossil fuel divestment campaign that's turned into the largest anti-corporate campaign ever by some measures. We're at about $40 trillion in endowments and portfolios that have divested, and that was mostly young people on college campuses that were provided most of the firepower there, and they were great. When they got out of college and wanted to keep working, they formed this thing called the Sunrise Movement that brought us the Green New Deal, and that's why we actually got the Inflation Reduction Act, because, you know, they asked for $30 trillion, and by the time it, you know, got through Joe Manchin, it was down to $300 billion, but that's still a reasonable sum of money, you know. There's some lesson in there about asking for 100 times more than you expect to get in the end. But and then, of course, while all that was going on, Greta Thunberg and this unbelievable movement of junior high and high school students emerged. I've gotten to know Greta well. She's one of my favorite people to work with on the whole planet. I adore her, but she would be the first to say there are 10,000 Gretas, and I've met 2,000 or 3,000 of them around the planet, and they have 10 million followers. That's how many kids were out on climate strike in September of 2019 before the pandemic hit. So really good, and for all the right reasons. I mean, if you're 20 right now, climate change hangs pretty heavy over your life. There's a reason that kids are anxious, you know. So it's good that they're hard at work. But I did hear one too many people tell me it's up to the next generation to solve these problems, which seems ignoble, but it also seems highly impractical. Climate change is a timed test. We've got a few years to solve it. Young people, for all their energy and idealism and intelligence, lack the structural power to make change on the scale we need in the time that we have. So if you start looking around for who has structural power, one big answer is people with hairlines like mine, you know. There are 70 million people over the age of 60 in this country, 10,000 more every day, which is more than the number of people born in this country every day. Not only are there a lot of us, multiply it by some factor because we all vote. There's no known way to stop old people from voting, you know. And we ended up with most of the resources. Fair or not, we've got about 70% of the country's financial assets compared to about 5% for millennials. So if you wanted to go after Wall Street or Albany or Washington, it would be good to have some people of a certain age. So we decided to try forming this thing called the Third Act. People say this is a bad idea because people get more conservative as they age. That's the standard political science sort of wisdom. But I doubted that it would be true, because if it ever had been, that it would be true now. Because if you think about it, the people who are in their 60s and 70s and 80s now, in their first act, were around for this period of epic social and cultural and political transformation. The period when we started taking women seriously in political life, the apex of the civil rights movement, the first Earth Day. There are people in here who marched on the first Earth Day in 1970, I have no doubt. And I'm looking at Eleanor Stein and Jeff Jones, who were, you know, did unbelievable work in that whole decade to help bring us, and, you know, on and on and on. If you have any doubt about that, look at what the Supreme Court went after on their right-wing rampage last summer. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Gun Control Act of 1968, the Clean Air Act of 1970, and Roe v. Wade 1973, okay? So if you were around then, you either participated in that or at least you bore witness to it. It is a fair criticism to say that taken as a whole, this generation may have spent its second act somewhat more interested in consumerism than in citizenship, okay? But that is water under the bridge, and now people emerge with resources, with a lifetime of skills, with some time, and with a sense that legacy is not some abstraction, you know? Once you're somewhat nearer the exit than the entrance, you begin to sense that the legacy is the thing you leave behind for the people you love the most. And we are in grave danger of really being the first people that leave behind a much shabbier planet than the one we were born on too. Which is why I think this thing has just mushroomed over a year. We've got 50,000 people engaged all across the country, new chapters forming all the time. Go to thirdact.org and sign up, and we'll get you engaged in all kinds of ways. It's been really fun because we're, you know, really serious about trying to back up young people. I'll tell two quick stories. When we started about a year ago, the very first thing that the kids from Fridays for the Future, which is the sort of local offshoot, the US offshoot of Greta's movement, they said, we really want to do something about these banks that are funding the fossil fuel industry, because there are 4 big US banks, Citi, Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, the 4 biggest banks on earth. I mean, the capital in capitalism. And they provide more funding to the fossil fuel industry than anybody on the planet, even though every scientist who looks at this stuff years ago said, we cannot build more infrastructure. We have to stop. They keep doing it. So we did, the kids said, we want to do a march. We did a march in a few places. I was in Brooklyn for it. And there were hundreds of high school kids, there always are, and because they completely get what's going on. They're somewhat sprier, so they were at the front of the march. But at the back, there was a large group of us with a big banner that said, fossils against fossil fuels, And so we kept building on that, and 2 weeks ago, we did this day of action across the country that had 100 simultaneous demonstrations, including a beautiful one in Albany. And they were really great. The one in DC, where I was, we managed to bring out, for the first time since the pandemic, sort of get the whole movement back in the streets a little bit. And we had the new head of the Sierra Club there, Ben Jealous, who was the former head of the NAACP. This marriage of the environmental movement and the civil rights movement is going to be very important, I think. And lots of other people, and so we had the requisite speeches and music, and then we went to close down the banks for the day. But we've reached an age where the prospect of sprawling across the concrete for 4 or 5 hours at a time is somewhat less enticing than it might once have been. So people had rounded up like 100 rocking chairs, and that's what we locked. We closed down those banks for the day because no one could get past the rocking chairs into the door. And it really was fun. And it's definitely how I'm doing sit-ins from now on. My new thing. So,
from one fossil to another, Bill. But you end this book on this kind of call. It almost seems like a Peace Corps for boomers. I mean, you're really demanding that they really get involved. Did you have that in mind when you were writing this for third act, or did it come after you wrote the book?
Well, a little bit. But I'll tell you what really got me thinking this in the first place. Some of you may have remembered this fight that we had that became like the biggest environmental battle of the last decade over this thing called the Keystone Pipeline, which we finally won, the first defeat for big oil in any project like this ever. I'd written the letter that asked people to come to Washington at the start of that fight to get arrested, because no one had heard of it, so we knew that we were going to need to do civil disobedience just to draw attention to it. It sounded like this is all I spent all my time getting arrested. No, 98% of the time you're doing the much more mundane tasks of lobbying and writing letters and whatever, but once in a while you need to be willing to. I wrote that letter, and in it I said, I do not think that young people should actually have to be the cannon fodder here. If you're 19, it's possible that an arrest record might not be the finest thing for your resume, One of the few unmixed blessings of growing older is, past a certain point, what the hell are they going to do to you? And so we didn't ask people when they showed up to get arrested, how old are you? That seemed rude, but we did say, who was president when you were born? And the 2 biggest cohorts were from the FDR and the Truman administrations. On the last day, there was a guy arrested with a sign around his neck that said, World War II vet, you remember this, Bill, World War II vet, handle with care. He was old enough that he'd been born in the Warren Harding administration, which frankly, I'd forgotten there was a Warren Harding administration, And it was beautiful, especially for the young people who were there, who got to see their elders acting in the way that we actually need elders acting in a working civilization. I don't mean necessarily going to jail. Not everybody has to go to jail, although I am always surprised by the number of people who tell me that it is on their bucket list and could I help, you know? But we do need people acting outside their comfort zone. Our planet is miles outside its comfort zone. Our democracy is miles outside its comfort zone. So we better be a little ways outside our comfort zone too if we're serious about doing something about this. And that's why, I think that's why people have been enjoying this so much. The kind of Peace Corps reference is a good one, Paul. One of the things I learned early on, I think, as an organizer was that I think people generally err on the side of asking people to do too little, not too much. I think people actually really often want to figure out how to take action on a scale that seems commensurate with the problems that we face. And so we work hard to try and figure out how to be truly effective on both these issues of democracy and climate.
I have to know, were any rocking chairs harmed during those protests?
A couple, yeah.
This book is very honest. The theme that runs through for me is racial reckoning, looking back at your own upbringing, looking at the current statistics. I'm looking at this audience, and you're a reporter, you're an observer. There's no diversity on a campus of 50% students of color, or almost no diversity, excuse me, in a city of 1 out of 3 are people of color. Is this message connecting with communities of color, and is it starting to turn the wheel to make up for what you talk about in Lexington?
Like the climate message, is that starting to connect with? Absolutely. If you do polling in this country, the two groups that care about climate change by huge majorities are Black Americans and Latino Americans. Overwhelmingly, no. I mean, in any you know, I mean, if someone waved a magic wand tomorrow and all the white people disappeared from America, our politics around climate and a lot of other things would improve considerably overnight, you know? But the environmental movement gets more diverse all the time at every level, including at the leadership. When we were doing this demonstration in DC, the 3 big speeches were from my old friend, Reverend Lennox Yearwood of the Hip Hop Caucus, Ben Jealous, and the brand new executive director of Greenpeace, Ebony Martin, first African American to run Greenpeace. And so there's a tremendous, and among young people who do this work, I mean, look, one of the reasons that this audience looks the way it does is because this is much closer to what America looked like when we were mostly born. You know, we realize when we're organizing Third Act that we're basically organizing, you know, who was in kindergarten in 1948, you know? And that's a very different America demographically than the one we exist in now. But the leadership at Third Act is similarly, you know, our lead advisor is the truly wonderful Akaya Windwood, former head of the Rockwood Leadership Institute, who's one of the most impressive people I've ever met, and she's our kind of most important front person out there making change. So everybody's trying, but I mean, I think the point is that if we're going to be dealing with the problem of climate change and the problem of racial and wealth inequality in this country, this is precisely the audience that has to get it together to do something about it, you know?
Excellent.
That's whose responsibility it is.
You tell a great story in the book, the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, another kind of tipping point and turning point. You're a young journalist. You drank a lot of beer that night. You were deep despair. You're not a big drinker, but you drank a lot of beer that night. You had a wicked hangover. What were you drinking the night of Trump's election, and what happened?
It's actually a really good question, and Trump's election was the final reductio ad absurdum of Reagan's election. It was the place where eventually you were going to end up if you started down that path. I was not 1,000% surprised that it happened. I was heartbroken, but I've spent most of my life in Warren County, in the least Stefanik's district. So
Condolences.
Yeah, so it was not, it's not as if I, don't have a pretty good sense of what's underway in a lot of America a lot of the time. If you're going to have a country of society in which we've been schooled to believe that we're the only thing that matters, that you are the most important thing on well, eventually you're going to end up with someone like Trump, who makes it his business to cater to every possible prejudice and bad instinct that might exist within any one of us. That's what happened. And I did not completely despair, because though I campaigned hard for Hillary Clinton in the fall, I'd spent the spring campaigning hard for Bernie, and I knew that there were a very large number of people in America who resonated with that message too. Bernie's slogan, "Not me, us," was the best political slogan of my lifetime, I think. And it represents the other side of what we're talking about. And really what we're seeing, I think, in the Biden, we're seeing Joe Biden kind of try to carry out Bernie's agenda. That's sort of how it worked. And it might well not have worked the other way. It might have been difficult for, it was hard enough for Biden to get anything done, and it's possible it might have been harder still for Bernie had he been. So at the moment, who knows what's going to happen next, but at the moment there could be worse outcomes, and so far some of the good part, our better angels are mounting some kind of mild offensive at the moment, and we should figure out how to bolster them at all times.
This book does end on a note of optimism, and I'm going to open it up for questions. Our colleague Jennifer Kowalski has a microphone. You can answer a question. One final prediction. What do you think you'll be drinking on election night 2024, Bill?
I don't know. The question is where we'll be. Third act last time around, we made the correct call for once that the crucial Senate election was going to be in Nevada. And we got everybody that we could out there. I was out there with my dear friend Rebecca Solnit, the essayist, for a bunch of days doing talks. We had people knocking on doors all over the place. Turns out, by the way, that older people possess a couple of useful political superpowers. One, they remember, they know how to write postcards and letters, something that is entirely
not emojis, more than emojis.
And two, when you knock on a door at a certain point, it's actually, you're far more likely to get a response if you're, look as harmless as I do by this point, So when the election was won, CNN, when they wrote about it, they singled out two groups that had been effective. The Culinary Workers Union in Las Vegas, who do an amazing job of turning out all the casino workers, and Third Act in Reno, and we were proud of that. And we'll try to figure out, again, sort of where to push hard.
Thirdact.org. Jen, if you take the back half, I'll take the front. If anyone wants to raise their hand and
I'm going to
ask
start
Bill
on
a
this
question.
side, at least.
I'll
Paul,
start right here, Jen.
Question?
I got the front.
You'll be
right
next.
here.
Thank you. So, I really appreciate what you're saying. I myself, like everyone else here, has probably demonstrated However, in this country right now, we can't do anything about guns. So if we can't do that, and what would the next step you recommend be environmentally and politically, and how can we do it?
Well, the problem with political fights is that the answer is always the same: more organizing and more mobilizing. The good thing about politics is it turns out that it's a matter of arithmetic, and the job is to assemble more of it than the other side. In this case, that generally means you have to assemble a lot more than the other side, because A, they come with huge amounts of money attached to them, and B, our electoral system, for all the reasons that you know, is rigged in the wrong direction. So that's one part of the answer. And the other part of the answer around climate and things is also to pull the other lever big enough to matter. One of them is marked politics, and the other is marked money or finance, And so that's what that's why we go so hard against the banks and the big asset managers and the insurance companies. New York State is, has divested, thanks to amazing organizing by remarkable people, and Mark Dunley and 1,000 others, has begun to divest its pension funds, but the New York State teachers have not, and that is an active and important campaign underway, and that's really good work. I'll say the other thing, just since we're in Albany at the moment, we're in the middle of the budget negotiations, and from my vantage point, hard to read governor of the state of New York is, been at the behest of the fossil fuel lobby playing a certain number of games here. I think that we beat back the effort to weaken the methane standards, but there's a lot of work around the environmental justice standards that are in the law that was passed, but now have to be, in the budget. So there's work to be done on all fronts in Albany. So, you look for the places where you have a chance of prevailing. And yeah, you're right. At the moment, we're not going to pass a nationwide gun control law. That's pretty clear. But there are things that we can do. And while we're doing the particular things that we can do, part of what we're doing, and this is maybe the most important work of activism in general, I think, is yes, you're fighting a series of discrete individual battles about things, and each of them is important, but together what they add up to is an attempt to shift the zeitgeist, to shift people's sense of what's normal and natural and obvious. And we can see those things working. 2 years ago, the polling around reproductive rights in this country was, sort of in the middle, whatever. People organized like crazy after that Dobbs decision, and now it's very clear what people in America want, and that'll produce some kind, I don't know how you get around the Supreme Court in the short or medium run, but it's definitely changing our politics in the same way that all the work we've done on pipelines and divestment things has changed the political salience of climate from an issue that was, we went through 3 straight presidential elections where they never even asked a question about it in the presidential debates, to the point in the last election where it was the #1 issue for Democrats in the primary, and that's the reason that Biden sat down with Bernie's people and hammered out this Build Back Better Act that we eventually got passed. So shifting the zeitgeist is one of the things that happens almost as a bonus when we do the work that we should be doing on all these issues and fights along the way.
I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this afternoon's settlement of the Dominion Fox defamation lawsuit, and whether you think it has implications for journalism going forward.
Well, it's a very good question. So the first thing is, it makes me exceedingly happy to imagine Rupert Murdoch having to sit down and write a check for $800 million, you know? Even if you're Rupert Murdoch, that's got to hurt a little bit, you know? And I think really, with the possible exception of the Koch brothers, there's no single person, no people who've ever done more to degrade and deform our democracy than Murdoch. As to the larger question, I mean, in some ways it may have been the best outcome because it damaged Fox and their credibility without sort of changing the controlling laws around libel and defamation in this country. So New York Times v. Sullivan, a really important decision, remains for the moment the standard by which, journalists do have to be allowed to make mistakes without being sued out of existence. In the case of Fox, they obviously weren't making a mistake. They were obviously lying through their teeth, which is why they ended up having to pay $800 million. But that case might have set some disturbing precedents too. I'm not a lawyer, but I am a journalist, and that's sort of my first impression of how it came out.
Oh, hi. I work at the Natural Resources Defense Council in fundraising. Hi. And my days are spent, trying to make the case for the diverse and compounding issues that stem from the climate crisis. And some days it just feels so overwhelming for myself and my colleagues. We have a lot of support, but I just wanted to ask you a personal question of what do you do when it can feel too much?
So it's a very good question. And first of all, thank you enormously for your work. And it matters immensely. There are days when I feel despairing about all this. I mean, the first book I wrote about all this 35 years ago had the cheerful title, The End of Nature, okay? So, it may be that I've had some time to work through my catharsis around, but there are days when I wake up and, if I'm feeling a little bleak about it, well, I console myself with the fact that at the very least I can see how much trouble I can cause for the bad guys in the course of a day. And sometimes that has to be enough, because I really, at this point, despise Exxon and Chevron and all the people who knew everything there was to know about climate change 30 years ago and lied about it straight up for decades and, kept it, cost us the time we needed to deal with it. So some days that has to be enough. But for the most part, I find the fact that this game is still on, that there's still to be really compelling. In the last decade, scientists, engineers dropped the cost of renewable energy 90%, as you know. At some point 4 or 5 years ago, it crossed some invisible line where it became the cheapest way to generate power. I mean, we live on a planet where the cheapest way to produce energy is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. Okay? That's Hogwarts scale magic. And it means that if we wanted to, there's no longer a technical or financial obstacle to making really rapid progress. All that stands in the way is inertia and toxic vested interest, okay? And those are very powerful forces, especially when they're combined, and they may be too much. They may prevent us from making change in the time that physics is allowing us. But that's not clear yet, it's a live issue, and so it's compelling drama to be a part of. I mean, this is the biggest thing that humans have ever done, and by orders of magnitude, And at some level, it's a test, I think, of whether the big brain was a good adaptation or not, I mean, it clearly gets us in some trouble, but can it get us out? And I suspect I suspect more all the time that the answer to that question really has to do with how big the hearts are that are connected to those brains. And that becomes the interesting organizing challenge. How do you reach people someplace where it actually is enough to get them to do things? So at the very least, it's not dull, you know, and that counts for something too. And for me personally, it's completely, I've organized my life so that I live someplace where I can get outdoors for an hour every day and wander around in the woods. And if I didn't, I would not have been able to keep doing this, because that's just somehow, that's the thing that, you know, keeps me, to the degree that I am sane, that's the thing that keeps me there, so.
There you go. Thank you. Hi there. I'm currently a master's student here at UAlbany in the secondary social studies education program, and I'm taking a class about civic education and how to teach young people how to become civically engaged. And I was just wondering what your recommendation is to how to foster that sense of civic agency in young people, especially with that huge pressure where young people need to be the people kind of stepping up to take up the role people haven't been taking up.
Well, I'm so glad you're doing that. Nothing could be more important. And let me answer it in a couple of different age groups, okay? When you have young kids, I think the best advice is try to keep them from even knowing too much about this stuff. Up to a certain age, our job is to make kids fall in love with the natural world. Because if they perceive it as terminal, I mean, people don't fall in love with terminally ill people for the most part because it's too much pain involved, you know? So, but at a pretty young age now, people are aware of what's going on. And so then the job is to make sure that you're giving them things to do that matter. And kids have far more effective bullshit detectors than adults, in my experience. Adults can fool themselves endlessly that they're going to, buying a Tesla will solve the climate crisis, you know. Kids are aware that it actually has to count. So that's why kids are, I mean, by the time you're 12, you're completely capable of being a leader in this climate movement, because I know hundreds of 12-year-olds who are. I work with them all the time. I spend a week every September writing college recommendations for people who are close colleagues of mine who just happen to be 17 and now it's time for them to go to college, you know? So the ability of young people to be real leaders here really counts. And, you know, stepping up, one of the things that makes that really possible for those kids to do that is to have a sense that there are people who have their back doing that work, which is why one of the real reasons we've done this third act thing, so that people can, kids can look up and think, I do not have to do this alone, because that is way too much to ask. And if you do, if that's how kids perceive where they are, then they are going to be completely depressed, completely anxious, completely convinced that it's all hopeless, because it is hopeless. If they're, you know, if our advice to the world is, you know, this is entirely dependent on 22-year-olds doing it, well, we're not going to do it. So, and they understand that. So, but I wrote my first picture book last year for 5-year-olds, a book called, I think it's called We Are Better Together. And the whole point of the book was just human beings can do remarkable things when they join together to work on things. The most important thing an individual can do is not be so much of an individual. It's join together with other people in movements large enough to have some chance of changing the ground rules.
I want to remind you, books are for sale, a book signing outside the auditorium directly after. We've covered an hour. We could stay here, but Bill's come from a long ride, and he's got a long ride left tonight, but this has been really inspiring, challenging, insightful, funny. I mean, I expect the rocking chair brigade is going to be following you out into the streets tonight. But I think I have an answer. I was so grateful that I met you in 1989 when you came into our newsroom. And what the hell happened? Bill McKibben happened. He's a hero, he's an author, he's an activist.
Thank you,
One more
Paul,
big round of
very much.
applause for Bill McKibben.